So, I will be talking today about collective loneliness, and this talk is in part based on a forthcoming chapter co-authored with Dr. Takashima on collective loneliness in the Handbook on Loneliness and Social Connection edited by Julie Barnett and colleagues. It should be coming out soon. And in that, we make a case for considering loneliness as a collective phenomenon. And I'll be outlining a few of the arguments in that chapter, and then using our research on community identity and loneliness to illustrate the implications of those arguments. So, to begin with, we can reflect on the fact that most research conducted on the phenomenon of loneliness is highly individualistic in nature. Now, that might seem self-evident, and it might seem quite natural. But it's not entirely uncontroversial. I just want to review, I guess, the main headlines from that research before reflecting on the methods that are being used, and perhaps then arguing for the alternative conceptualization of loneliness in collective terms. So firstly, you will all be aware of the importance of loneliness as a social, a cultural, a medical phenomenon. Loneliness kills. The evidence is overwhelming. The World Health Organization will shortly be producing its international report detailing evidence of the impacts of loneliness on health across the world. The effects of loneliness, of course, on mobility and mortality are greater than that of obesity and equivalent to that of smoking, the two other big public health challenges of our generation. And we know quite a bit about how loneliness impacts upon individual health. The work of Cassiopo and colleagues has done a lot to identify the physiological, the neurological mechanisms through which loneliness has its effects. The neuroimaging work identifying the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis as the core mechanism, the neural mechanism through which the stress response is activated in people suffering from chronic loneliness, resulting in higher levels of cortisol and other stress hormones and inflammation at the cellular level. In terms of impacts on physiology and behavior, there are profound impacts on sleep disturbance, and over time, increased risk of stroke and heart attack. There are impacts on cognition, the way people think, and with a particularly pronounced impact on executive function for people who are chronically lonely. And over time, an increased risk of dementia. And loneliness has the peculiar characteristic of being self-perpetuating. For people who are chronically lonely, the increased threat perception that they are subject to means that they are more likely to perceive social interactions negatively, they're more likely to withdraw from social interactions, hence, over time, loneliness becomes self-perpetuating. But we can reflect a little in terms of how loneliness is defined and studied. In terms of the definition of loneliness actually is quite old at this stage. It dates from the 80s in the seminal work of Peplau and Perlman, and it focuses in on the cognitive and emotional aspects of the individual, just the distress caused by the perception of the gap between the desired and current social connections. There's often the distinction made between emotional loneliness that occasioned by the lack of deep and meaningful social connections, and social loneliness, the lack of a social network, but still centered around the individual. It's measured through self-report scales administered at the individual level. And indeed, the range of methods that produce that beautiful and rich literature attesting to the mechanisms of loneliness is very individualistic. The surveys, either cross-sectional or longitudinal, are administered at the individual level, biological assays at the individual level, neuroimaging at the individual level, of course aggregated across individuals, but it's still an individualistic methodology. And of course, the experimental and intervention work. Now, the interesting thing is that when you look at what works to reduce loneliness, individual level approaches are only one part of the bigger picture. Cognitive behavior therapy, which is the gold standard in treatment for depression, certainly does work for loneliness, but the effects of other types of interventions are just as well established. And increasingly, the other forms of intervention are gaining an evidence base. So one support, dyadic interaction, group-based support, tailored group interventions, systems-based approaches, so things like social prescribing, where people are connected into local communities with the help of multiple agencies. Okay, all of these are very much collective initiatives, okay, beyond the individual. So there's a bit of a disjuncture between how we define and understand loneliness and what works in treating loneliness. Okay, so how might we think of loneliness as collective then? How might we recover a collective understanding of loneliness? Well, if we reflect on it from first principles, groups can be lonely. Specific demographic groups are more vulnerable to loneliness than others. Okay, individuals, members of groups who are suffering from disabilities, ethnic minorities, LGBTQ populations are more vulnerable to loneliness in many different societies. Secondly, loneliness can be the result of other people. Okay? Loneliness often results from exclusion and discrimination in the workplace or within local communities. We also note that places can be lonely-genic, and something I'll come back to later in the talk. Places can be characterized by high levels of loneliness over and above the aggregate of loneliness among the population. Okay? And loneliness is, of course, a cultural phenomenon. There are different stereotypes and stigmas associated with loneliness in different cultures, different cultural norms and expectations of social connectedness for different types of groups. Okay, so the question would be, is there a distinctive experience of loneliness that is collective as opposed to the other levels of loneliness that are perhaps better captured, better understood, and better evidenced? As it happens, within the mainstream loneliness literature, there is a tradition that has attempted to capture collective loneliness. And this is work by Cacioppo and colleagues. Starting round about 2005, Hockley and Cacioppo and other colleagues were looking at the main measure of loneliness, the UCLA measure of loneliness, the long version, 20 items. And they did a large-scale survey asking over 2,500 students to complete the tool and conducted a factor analysis. And as with some earlier studies, they found a 3-factor model captured the variance within the data most effectively. 3 levels of loneliness, holding across for both men and women. Isolation at the most micro level, characterized by aloneness, personal rejection, social withdrawal. Relational connectedness, lack of familiarity, closeness, feelings of support from familiar others. And then collective connectedness, and that is lack of feelings of group cohesion and identification. Now, the latter two are phrased positively because that reflects the phrasing of the items in the UCLA scale, which is positively and negatively worded items. And so the items for collective connectedness are: I feel in tune with the people around me, I feel part of a group of friends, I have a lot in common with the people around me, I am an outgoing person. Of course, then negatively scored to total into the UCLA scale outcome. In a follow-up study, in a second study in the same paper, the Hockley and colleagues administered this to over 200 ethnically diverse older adults living in the United States. And they found the same structure held for this population. They also found that the different levels were predicted by different demographic characteristics. Intimate connectedness, or that isolation measure, predicted by singlehood. Relational connectedness, predicted by friends and relatives. Collective connectedness was uniquely predicted by group memberships. Okay, so it looks to be a particular aspect of loneliness captured by the UCLA scale, and that is capturing the group level of experience. They then attempted to replicate this cross-culturally with mixed success, looking at a sample of younger and older Chinese adults living in China, and found that, again, that each type of loneliness had unique predictors, but they did find a bit of age variation. The group memberships only predict collective connectedness among younger participants. And they put that down to the difficulty in translating the scale, okay? Which on the surface of it, does make sense. It's difficult to translate scales between cultures, but perhaps on a more subtle level, it could reflect actual conceptual differences between cultural contexts. How did they interpret this? Okay, well, actually, you see a shift in interpretation over time. Initially, in 2005, the interpretation was this could be a group level of phenomenon, reflecting a social identity, the shared aspect of the self that is derived from group membership. And so they say people are motivated to form relationships that lead to the acquisition of social identities and to the incorporation of close others into their self-construals. That's classic social identity theory, and we'll return to that a little bit later. But by 2015, that had been abandoned in favor of an evolutionary explanation. And drawing on the work of Dunbar and others, they said, well, actually, in our ancient undocumented past as humans, we have lived in groups at these three levels. There's an intimate level of an inner core of a support clique of 5 individuals with constant contact, a relational loneliness or sympathy group of 15 others, regular contact, high cost support, your friends, I guess. Collective connectedness, an active social network of 150 to 1,500 individuals. We provide you with information and low-cost support in hunting, warfare, whatever our distant ancestors were up to at the time. Now, while this is, fits well with their 3-part distinction in terms of the UCLA scale, we do know that it does have some limitations. It really does assume a fairly generic function of groups. Yes, some people, certainly, in terms of family, that makes sense, yeah, intimate others providing you with connection. Not everyone has family. Other people can get their intimate connections from other groups, yeah. Likewise for the other 2 types of groups. We know there is a great deal more variation in groups and group function across different societies, at least in our current state of evolution. Secondly, it ignores the huge literature on group dynamics. Yeah, that just goes out the window. This is a totalizing explanation without need to recourse to understand how groups actually work. And as it happens, there are some bits and pieces of literature that I'll talk about now, but really the interpretation has stopped there, which I think is a little bit unfortunate. Replications, that study, the tripartite model, was replicated in USA, Europe, Asia, Australia, and there's some evidence that the different levels are predicted by different factors, and each has different outcomes. There are some relationships between the levels of connectedness. For example, in Northern Ireland, a study by Shelvin and colleagues found that young people tended to be high on intimate loneliness and low on collective loneliness, okay? So, and they say, well, this is reflecting young people being lonely in a crowd. You might be connected to your friends, but you're lonely inside. Yeah? Sun and colleagues, in a study in the United States on older adults, found that bereavement led to a drop in intimate and relational connectedness, but not collective loneliness. So it's actually the same finding, but they interpret it in completely the opposite direction. They say groups make us resilient in times of individual level and local level social vulnerability. Yeah, same finding. The interpretation is exactly the opposite. So we notice a little bit of a weakness in the theoretical explanation. It's not really firm enough to be giving us direction in our interpretation. And then there's some findings that only collective connectedness predicts things like increased meaning over time. Okay, so I'm outlining a case for this being a rather limited approach. For now, I think it's got enormous potential, but for now, I think the application of it has been rather limited. It's not yet related to the broader set of social and cultural factors we know to affect groups and loneliness, and is separate from the study of group processes. It's also unclear how to use the findings. Okay? Make more social connections. Sure, yeah, but what type of social connections? What type of groups? Yeah, where do you do this? What are the pros and the cons of doing that? Yeah, there's very little detail in terms of what might be recommended from that tradition of work. Although it does pose interesting questions in terms of, do those different levels of loneliness have different effects? Yeah, at the physiological level as well as the social level. How do they interrelate? Can groups offset your loneliness from bereavement, for example? Yeah, those are big questions that could be answered. And is there utility in identifying and addressing each level separately? Okay. A completely separate line of evidence of research has attempted to address this from the perspective of group dynamics. It's a little bit odd. So the social identity research isn't referenced by Cacioppo and colleagues. The social identity folk don't really reference the Cacioppo literature. Okay, so there's a gap here, two separate parallel literatures. But the social identity approach takes as a starting point the relationships between groups on health. Daniel has made a lovely outline of the dynamics of this, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. Groups impact health on a number of different ways. They impact upon appraisal processes, so our perception of our ability to cope with adversity. They also address individuals' needs in a variety of ways. And multiple group memberships have a cumulative effect. The more groups you belong to, the more socially resilient you are, according to the main theory. Now, there is also a dark side to group belonging, in that groups can also be a source of exclusion and discrimination. So it's not that there is a simplistic relationship between groups and health. Okay, and so, it's a big area of work. There are around about 500 studies up to 2023 and a high level of policy impact around the world. How does this relate to loneliness? Well, in 2022, Alex Haslam and colleagues made a case for the social identity approach to loneliness. It starts with that relationship between groups and health and well-being. Groups are good for you, okay? And his argument, and their argument, is that groups make a particular form of valuable social connection, that with other group members, possible, okay? So loneliness, from this perspective, is the lack or loss of group memberships, okay? And their argument, in reviewing a lot of the literature on this, is that, well, you can see the relationship between groups and loneliness is typically an inverse relationship, and also group-based interventions are particularly effective at reducing loneliness. But what I'd like to do in the second part of the talk is to kind of review that literature and to suggest that the picture is a little bit more complicated than that. Okay, and we will note that in this literature, loneliness can be conceptualized as a predictor, as in this paper by Haslam and colleagues. A lack or loss of identity predicts outcomes, or it can be a mediator of group processes. It can be the mechanism through which groups work, or it can be an outcome. This is what groups give us. by way of their health and well-being. And these distinctions are important because they direct us to look at different aspects of loneliness, and they direct us to address loneliness in different ways. I'll quickly review this literature. So the first, in line with that position piece article, is loneliness as a predictor of lack of social cure processes. And from the early days in the social cure tradition, this was how loneliness was addressed. So paper by Cruz, for example, looking at multiple group memberships using a nationally representative data set, showed that multiple group memberships have preventative and curative effects on depression over time. And the inference from that is the lack of group memberships reflect a degree of loneliness, which leave people vulnerable to depression over time. It's not a direct measure, it's an inference. That's one of the earlier papers in this tradition. Another very interesting approach is to look at loneliness in relation to specific significant groups. So in a Crensby study of Australian soldiers, they looked at soldiers who had come out of the military. Yeah? And they found that they missed the military. It was a key aspect of their identity they had lost. But it was specifically missing belonging to the army that was predictive of poor health when they were on the outside and in civilian life. Okay? So it's identity-specific loneliness predicting lower well-being. Secondly, and this is the bulk of research, loneliness is studied as a social cure mechanism. So it's how groups work. You're a member of groups, and then this reduces loneliness. Studies by Jason McIntyre in the UK on student friendship groups indicating that groups predict belonging to a group as a student predicts lower depression, anxiety, and paranoia, and these effects are mediated by reduced loneliness. Okay, replicated in terms of a national representative sample of people who did or did not take part in sports group. Sports group membership lowers depression through both physical activity on the one hand and reduced loneliness on the other. Nationally representative sample by Van Dyck and colleagues in Germany. Group identification predicts lower stress and illness, again via reduced loneliness. And it's typically studied along with other mediators as well. So from our own group, a study indicating that identification improves sleep via reduced loneliness and then has health and well-being outcomes. Okay, then loneliness as an outcome in its own right. This is more recent work, and it's kind of been occasioned by the pandemic, in which loneliness became much more of a central concern. So the pandemic leading to a focus on loneliness, especially among university students, but also among stroke support groups and residents of local communities, all indicating that groups impact upon loneliness longitudinally, especially during the pandemic. Reflected also in the group-based interventions designed by our colleagues in Australia, Groups for Health and Groups for Belonging, whereby people are actively recruited to peer groups in a structured intervention, combining elements of CBT with peer support and scaffolding for new group memberships. Very effective. It's got to the RCT stage, and they are really kind of gold standard evidence for the impact of groups on reducing loneliness. But also, as I say, the dark side of loneliness. Loneliness is what we would call as a social curse rather than a social cure. Discrimination and exclusion leading to loneliness. So, for example, stigmatization among Chinese migrant workers in cities in China, leading to higher levels of loneliness. Loneliness among deaf adolescents in United States schools due to exclusion. And interestingly, a study by Lee and Spinney, not strictly speaking in the social identity tradition, but indicating that membership of multiple vulnerable groups doesn't have an additive effect, it has a multiplicative effect. Yeah, you are many times more vulnerable to loneliness if you belong to low education, foreign nationals, if you're female and you're older. Okay, so a cumulative effect of belonging to vulnerable groups in terms of loneliness, and of course in terms of stigma. Yeah, stigmatization of different groups, LGBT groups, ethnic minority groups, leading to discrimination, leading to higher levels of loneliness. Okay. So how might we bring these two traditions together in a fruitful way? Well, collective connectedness, as we've argued, points to the need to consider different types of loneliness at different levels. Also to consider the specific predictors of loneliness at a collective level versus the other levels. And also it has that rich depth of literature on the mental and biological effects of loneliness. Okay. The social identity approach, on the other hand, points to the need to examine loneliness within its context and its group context in particular. That's looking at the broader range of social factors, the characteristics of specific groups. It points to the need to understand how loneliness flexibly affects group dynamics, not in a simplistic way, but as a cause, as a mediator, as an outcome of group dynamics, reflecting the complexity of lived reality. Understand loneliness in the context of multiple groups. Yeah, there's not one group at a time. People belong to multiple groups simultaneously. And as Daniel was outlining just immediately before, and we've heard from other speakers earlier in the day, the groups of, for example, older men, a combination of identities shaping the experience of loneliness and social dynamics for those particular groups. And of course, the need to harness group dynamics to reduce loneliness, or as one pathway to reduce loneliness. Okay, in the final part of the talk, I want to bring the two together and to look at community identity and loneliness. Admittedly, it draws more from the social identity approach than the collective connectedness approach, but I think in future we're hoping to use some of the insights from the collective connectedness approach as well. We're going to take the example of local community, okay? And starting with the idea of neighborhood. I think the social identity approach highlights very well that some groups have particular psychological resonance with people. Not everyone, but for most people. For most people, family, community, nation are particularly important. They've been historically important in many different cultural contexts. And community is often the one that receives least attention within psychology. But the evidence shows that community has really important effects for our social well-being, as well as our economic well-being and our physical and mental well-being. And as we've argued in a previous paper, neighborhood has the particular characteristic of many different groups of being a context, a place whereby social interactions occur, as well as a cohort, your other neighbors being members of the same group. It's not unique in that way, but it does have a very powerful effect upon residents. And we would argue that understanding neighborhood requires an understanding of group dynamics, as we've just talked about, but also the broader social factors that impact upon neighborhoods. So crowd psychology documents the real importance of co-presence, people living side by side when it comes to responses to emergencies and disasters. Literature by John Drury and colleagues attesting to the importance of that. Environmental psychology is really important because the physical context within which you live, in terms of noise, in terms of heat and cold, in terms of pollution, are all really important determinants of people's lives and the way that they interact with one another. Economic psychology is important because the wealth or deprivation of a neighborhood impacts upon the social relationships there. And political psychology is important because neighborhoods are political units. They vote. People take part in collective action on a neighborhood basis. Not only on a neighborhood basis, but it is one form of collective action. And why is it important to have those different dimensions in mind? Because, as mentioned earlier, loneliness has been recognized by the World Health Organization as a social determinant of health. Among other factors, it's recognized to operate at local community level to determine between 30 and 55% of people's health outcomes. So it has a huge impact upon health and well-being. Healthcare accounts for around about 15%. Okay? And we know that loneliness, as one of these factors, is geographically distributed. I'll show you some maps in a minute to illustrate that. And the difference between these factors operating in different areas is the difference in mortality of 10 years of lifespan in the UK. 10 years between the poorest and the most affluent areas in the UK. In fact, that has increased over the past decade. Up to 20 years in terms of healthy life expectancy between the poorest and the most affluent areas due to these social determinants of health, including loneliness. And we know that there are lonely-genic places. Particular places lend themselves to loneliness. Poor community and transport infrastructure, lack of public spaces and amenities, crime and safety concerns, corrode social relationships and lend themselves to loneliness. We need to know how all of these things interact to understand the impact of community on loneliness. To illustrate that a little bit more clearly, here's the loneliness map of England, taken from the Office for National Statistics. These are all the local authorities across England, and that's the average loneliness of the local population. Okay? And you can see there's quite a bit of variation in terms of the proportion that are often or always lonely. The map there on the right is Nottingham, and you can see that the area at the bottom, that's Nottingham, just above it is Ashfield, and above it in dark blue is Mansfield. And to look at another set of maps, okay? The map on the far right is the same map, loneliness. The next one in is ill health, okay? The next one is household poverty. The next one is poor work. These are all pretty much the same map, yeah? The social determinants that are impacting on people's health are also closely related to loneliness at that level, and actually the patterning is much more pronounced at a more granular level. Why is this important? Well, because governments across the world have this data, and they know that local community is crucially important for health and well-being. And now Japan, probably now the world leader in policy on loneliness, has, as a part of its local policy documentation, has mandated local authorities to intervene at community level. And so we were listening in an earlier talk today about Basho. Yeah? Local government being mandated to create places where people feel comfortable, safe, and accepted within local communities. Yeah? Community volunteer circles at local level. Using parks and public spaces to reduce loneliness. Museums, public halls, libraries, all of the things that we know are important at local community level are being recognized by government, but there isn't a theory underpinning it, or not a coherent, substantial, evidence-based theoretical underpinning. So that's why we think it's really important to progress this. So how does community create loneliness? As a starting point, we know from our research and that of others in this tradition, there is a very strong relationship between the degree to which you identify with your community and lower levels of loneliness. Or put it the other way about, if you do not identify with your local community, you are more likely to be lonely. That's our starting point. If we look through this in terms of the social identity approach, we know then that lack of community has an impact on loneliness. Okay? So lack of community, community deprivation, and the corrosion of local community social infrastructure is related to increased loneliness, or the inability of local communities to help one another and to socialize with one another, and increase loneliness. Loss. People moving between communities experience higher levels of loneliness. Residential mobility leads to loneliness, at least in the short term, for a large number of people. Many readjust, some don't, but it is a social vulnerability. So loss of community leads to loneliness. Exclusion from community leads to loneliness. Prejudice against vulnerable minorities at local community level leads to higher levels of loneliness. Our own work in Mid-Knots demonstrates that. And the stigmatization of different areas, the characterization of an area as a bad area, also corrodes community cohesion and increases loneliness. Can community identification reduce loneliness? Yes, it can. And big whole of community interventions have demonstrated that this is possible. One example is Neighbour Day in Australia. One day across Australia, people are encouraged to come out and have events that brings everyone together. Okay, a festival not unlike the one ongoing at the minute in Sapporo. Okay, all of community approaches have been demonstrated to have an impact in reducing loneliness that lasts. In terms of those participating in the event, they have lower loneliness at significant periods further down the line. Social prescribing, that intervention which links people into local community activities, works. A big evidence base demonstrating that it reduces loneliness. And we've demonstrated that it happens in part through group processes. The best connections in social prescribing lead to feelings of local community belonging. In contrast, mismatched identities between yourself and the community group that you're referred to increases loneliness, according to our participants. And we know that the effect occurs through increased group memberships, reducing loneliness by increasing community belonging. So what's the mechanism? Well, our evidence suggests that some of the mechanisms occur through, on the one hand, increased community identification, on the other hand, the diversity of groups that you belong to within a community. And so this is evidence, this is a nationally representative sample in the UK, community identification, impacting on well-being through increasing social support and therefore reducing loneliness, or the direct relationship. The more you feel as if you belong to your community, that also reduces loneliness. The second model, the diversity of groups, so belonging to different types of groups, decreasing loneliness through increasing people's creative self-efficacy. Okay, so it aligns with a slightly different literature within the social identity tradition. If you belong to diverse groups, you tend to be more creative or believe in your creative capabilities, and that, we think, reduces cognitive inflexibility, addresses some of the cognitive challenges around loneliness, and that's how this effect, we believe, is happening. Right, so just to sum up then, adopting a collective approach to loneliness, through this lens, we are drawn to appreciating the characteristics that are distinctive about local community. In part, this is community as context and all of those environmental, economic, and social factors that interact with loneliness at local level. But also community as a cohort, fellow neighbours, and the bonds with fellow neighbours reducing loneliness. And we know that leaving leads to loss, exclusion leads to loneliness, but connectedness and targeted connectedness can reduce loneliness. Where does this leave us, thinking about both of those traditions in tandem? Well, we would argue that the social identity approach is a biopsychosocial approach to understanding and reducing loneliness. Okay? And combined with collective connectedness, think is a very powerful way to understand and think about that relationship between those three, and we would argue 4 levels. Okay? Biological. How do these group and contextual factors impact upon the physical effects of loneliness, especially through those psychological mechanisms? The psychological. How do other intersecting identities shape the effect of a neighborhood on loneliness? Other subgroup identities, other gender identities, for example. The social. How do neighborhood economics, environment, and politics shape loneliness as well? And to add to that, the cultural. Yeah? How do different cultural understandings and practices in local communities shape these processes? And I guess to circle back to Daniel's talk, we're firmly convinced, and we're delighted to be working with our partners in Tohoku University and Hokkaido University on men's sheds. We're firmly convinced that men's sheds are a really great place to be examining these processes, of examining a collective loneliness within its cultural as well as social, psychological, and biological context. Okay, thank you.